on, Foxy. It's your birthday. Not for real, just for play. This is Cree Summer, and Moana Nui will be right back.
This is our last panel of the day, so if this is your first time joining us, you've missed a lot of really cool stuff, including the fire alarm. This panel is on comics and Native Americans. So first up, we have Ian Jones from the University of Iowa, who is presenting Is It Comics? Looking at Mexican colonial era manuscripts through a comic studies lens. Second, we have Mike Bittner from Stanford University, Off the Beaten Warpath, a look at Native American representation in Chris Claremont's X-Men comics. And finally, we have Elke Defever. Get that? Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Okay. From Indiana University, presenting Indian Identity, the representation of Native Americans in dessinées, translated for American audiences. Unfortunately, Sara Spurgeon is not able to join us, so you're not going to hear anything about Echo. But I'm sure these presenters will probably talk about that in Q&A if you have stuff to say. Anyway, I will pass the microphone over to Ian.
I gesticulated a lot, so it would be better if I stand up here and I can point and make the PowerPoint statements. All right, hi everyone. I am thrilled to be here with you all today. As Kate said, my name is Ian Jones. I am an instructional designer at the University of Iowa. My PhD, however, is in colonial Spanish American literature, and my dissertation is actually about how contemporary comics artists have used the narrative and graphical representations of the conquest, especially that of Mexico, for their ideological ends, be they didactic, or political, or fantastical. However, today I'm eager to dig into an early colonial era pictorial document and see what we can learn from it by looking at it through comics. As you can see, and as Kate said, my presentation is called Is It Comics? Looking at Mexican colonial era manuscripts through a comic studies lens, so let's dive right in. In his text, Understanding Comics and Invisible Art, Scott McCloud gives us his definition of what makes a comic a comic. He states they are, quote, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information in or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. In some respects, this definition seems quite narrow. To wit, this definition excludes single-panel cartoons, as they do not consist of multiple sequential images. So your average Far Side is, per this definition, not a comic. Guys, it's not a comic, it's a cartoon, it's not a comic. However, this definition also has a level of broadness to it that McCloud delves into in the following pages, where he claims such things as the Codex Zuchnatal, which contains the story of the 8-year jaguar claw, or the Bayou Tapestry, for example, are, in fact, comics. So they get a big green thumbs up from Scotty Way. Now, this definition to me is always fell off. In my brain, of course, the Far Side is a comic. And maybe that's because I read it in collections and big books full of years of worth of cartoons, so it felt more like a cohesive whole. And as a scholar of colonial era Spanish America, the skin on the back of my neck stands up when someone says the Codex Zuchnatal is a comic. That's a codex. That is a document that existed hundreds of years before comics existed as a medium, and it feels, at least to me, post facto to include it in a definition of comics. Then, I read the 2022 article, How to Read an Aztec Comic, Indigenous Knowledge, Mother's Bodies and Tamales in a Pot, by Felicia Rapsky-Lopez and Jordan Culver, a brilliant academic article presented in comic format. Lopez is a fellow Mesoamerican scholar, and Culver is an artist, that brings a comics lens to the Codex Borgia, which is one of the most intact surviving pre-Columbian documents, a pictographic representation of pre-conquest life and stories, and the way that Lopez uses her understanding of artistic creation and comics as a medium to enrich and reinterpret some of the images from the Codex Borgia in direct combat with what has often been understood as what's being said in the Codex Borgia, which had been interpreted as this vision of human sacrifice and like real gory stuff. But that Rapsky Lopez here sees as a story of miscarriage and like family drama and tragedy. And it was only through comics that she was able to come to this interpretation of the text, which has really made people rethink this document that we all knew really well. So interacting with this article made me rethink my previous assertion that calling these pre-industrial age comics, or documents comics, didn't make sense. So I choose today to put this definition to the test. I want to reassess a particular document, the lienzo de Tlaxcala, or the Tlaxcalan linen, which I'll talk a little bit about what it is, through the lens of comic studies and see what we can learn through looking at this artifact through new eyes. But first, a little background on what the lienzo is and why it's interesting. So 500 years ago, Hernán Cortés led the conquest of what is today mainland Mexico, focusing on what is commonly known today as the Aztec Empire. First off, Aztec was not a word they would have used for themselves. The people were known as the Mexica. They were largely Nahuatl-speaking people in the Triple Alliance, a group of 3 city-states that controlled most of the commerce and kind of ruled this area of the world at the time. You can see a map of Lake Texcoco here in the pre-Columbian era. The three cities of the Triple Alliance were Tlacopan, which is on the far west coast over here, Texcoco up on the northeast corner, and then Mexico Tenochtitlan, which is the famous floating city where Moctezuma was the ruler that you have all probably heard about, at least superficially as you know about the conquest of Mexico. Consequently, when Cortés and the Spaniards show up to the mainland, the people of the Triple Alliance, they subjugated all the other cities around. One of the cities that was most annoyed by being under the control of the Triple Alliance was the city of Tlaxcala. So when Cortés and the Spaniards showed up, the people of Tlaxcala chose to ally themselves with the Spanish to overthrow the rulers of the Triple Alliance in a bid to secure more freedom and control over their native compatriots. So that's kind of who Tlaxcala is. A lot of times today they're kind of seen as like traitorous people for allying with the Spanish against the native Mexica. We have the story of this conquest told from many people in many different points of view. From the Spanish themselves, from sources such as the letters of Cortés, or Bernal Díaz del Castillo's Historia Verdadera de la Conquista de la Hispana, the true story of the conquest of New Spain, or from the point of view of the conquerors, such as the Florentine Codex, which you see a picture from the frontispiece of this 12th book here. And the Florentine Codex, if you're not familiar with it, is basically one of the world's first ethnographic documents. Bernardino da Sahagún worked with the people of Texcoco to make this 12-volume document that kind of told the story of who the Mexica were pre the arrival of the Spanish in the first 11 books, talking about agriculture, commerce, the gods, the government. And then in book 12 tells the story from the point of view tells the story of the conquest from the point of view of the people of Texcoco, some of those people who were conquered. The Lienzo de Tlaxcala, the document we're going to look at today, in contrast, bridges the divide between these two kinds of usual ways we hear of the story of conquest. Because it is told by native artisans, but by the natives of Tlaxcala, the group that sided with the Spanish. And as such, it paints the conquest in a very different light than other native-produced documents, and tries to portray those who allied with the Spanish as the bravest and most valiant of the native peoples. So the Lienzo itself was created in the mid-16th century, probably between 1551 and 1553, right in there. And there were 3 copies made of it, one of which was sent back to the king in Spain, one of which was sent to the viceroy in Mexico City, and one that was kept in the governmental offices in the city of Tlaxcala itself. Unfortunately, all 3 of these original versions have been lost at this point. There were 2 copies of the Lienzo that were made from the version that was in Tlaxcala before it was lost. The oldest was made in 1773 by Manuel de Indigenous, and another was made by Alfredo Lopez Chavero in 1892. So that is our understanding of the document today comes from these 2 copies. And while there are differences between the 2 versions, not unlike when publishers go back and refresh the coloring or replace some panels in a comic, the basic structure and layout of the document remains the same between the 2 versions. Most scholars believe that the figural and gestural representations of the Lopez Chavero version are likely closer to the original document, whereas the Indigenous took much greater liberties with this copy. And here is a recreation of what the original lienzo would have looked like and how it was laid out. So it's a huge, long piece of linen, big old canvas. They estimated it was probably about 12 feet tall and like 3 feet wide. At the top here, we have a breakdown of the current governmental organization of Tlaxcala, its officials, both Native and Spanish, all presented under a large depiction of the imperial seal of Spain, underneath which is the seal of the then colonial government of Tlaxcala. So that's that top bit. In this middle portion here, we have the major happenings of the conquest of Mexico Tenochtitlan itself, laid out in chronological order through the arrival of the Spanish to Tlaxcala, all through the overthrow of the Triple Alliance and the establishment of New Spain, quite literally atop its bones in the ruins of Mexico Tenochtitlan, where Mexico City exists still to this day. And while most narratives of the conquest kind of end here with the fall of Tenochtitlan, the lienzo does something interesting. It continues the story of the expansion and consolidation of the power of the nascent viceroyalty, with the people of Tlaxcala serving as warriors on the part of the Spanish leadership in their further battles against other groups outside of the Triple Alliance's borders up through 1541, when the last battle on the very bottom of the lienzo took place. So that's kind of the layout, and that's what I think makes this one interesting, is that it has that bottom third. We don't really talk a lot about in Mesoamerican studies. So what I'd like to do is start thinking about the lienzo here as a comic, as a big Sunday comics page spread telling the story of the conquest in its different versions. I've captured two versions in the following slides side by side. The latter version by Lopez Chavero is going to be the one on the left, as it's usually a little clearer, easier to make out. And then I also included in many of the following slides the version from 1773 by Indigenous. And you'll kind of see how they can kind of differ while still kind of portraying or conveying the same information. So our drama begins in the very first panel, La Moana, where an ambassador from the approaching Spanish here in the middle goes to Tlaxcala with words for the leadership of the city and explaining the goals of the Spanish. We know from other sources that the people of Tlaxcala knew about the arrival of the Spanish and what they were about to do, so it's likely they were looking for a chance to ally themselves with these European conquistadors anyway, but that's not kind of what's presented in the panel itself. It's in the next panel that we see the arrival of the Spanish, Cortés and his men on horse, on the right please, and accompanied by the translator Moana Nui. We'll talk more about her and how she fits into this document in just a moment. Once Cortés shows up, he is basically the main character of our comic for most of the panels that follow the section, as he ingratiates himself to the native population and conquers those who refuse to ally with him. So you can see Cortés on the horse in both of these. And the leaders of Tlaxcala, upon the arrival of the Spanish, see this as a huge opportunity for growth and power, so of course they convert to Christianity. Here is their baptism and confirmation, as we see in both versions, which is immediately followed by them getting their hands dirty. A panel showcasing the massacre of the city of Cholula, which was the first major offensive in which the Tlaxcaltecan people took place. So here is the first big battle that the people of Tlaxcala took place. As you can see, there's differences between these two versions, but both of them depict a brutal, bloody event. You've got body parts all over the ground on the left side of the Lopez Chavero version. We've got visceral gore all over the bottom of the Indigenous version. Francisco Lopez de Gomara, who was a chronicler in the 1600s, claimed over 6,000 people were slaughtered in the space of a few hours in this battle, as Cortés had been informed by his translators that the people of Cholula were planning on killing the Spanish in their sleep, and he said, no thank you, and ordered a preemptive strike on the people of Cholula. Per the written story of Tlaxcala that accompanied the lienzo, the Tlaxcaltecan people looked at this battle and took it and joined in on it because in the past they had sent an ambassador to Cholula who had been tortured. There's not a whole lot of evidence that actually took place. There's in fact a lot of evidence that they were just like, oh, this is a chance to suck up to the Spanish war. So let's get to killing. And killing they did. It was a very, very bloody, very terrible battle. The next panel that I kind of want to look at, and I think is really interesting, is two illustrations later. We're at the 11th illustration. where Cortés has arrived at the city of Mexico Tenochtitlan to trade with Moctezuma, the emperor, the leader of Mexico Tenochtitlan, which is the biggest and most important city of the Triple Alliance, who is depicted in this on the left. So we see Cortés on the right seated, we see Moctezuma on the left seated. Unlike in almost every other illustrated depiction of this event, this appears to be a meeting between peoples. In almost every other version, it is either big Cortés, little Moctezuma because he sucks, or vice versa. Here is our wonderful leader Moctezuma who is betrayed, and here's this terrible Cortés. But here, they're on the same plane. They're portrayed almost as equals here. If anything, Cortés is portrayed as a little more powerful because in both you can see that he's inside the building, even though this is Moctezuma City. So there's some weird panel construction happening here. And this curious placement by the artist reinforces something that happens multiple times through these panels. Here's a bunch of different panels that we can look at. Cortés is almost always given a place of prominence and power, even though this is a native-produced, native-sourced document. He is presented very literally, as I said, as the hero of this story. We can see, him seated here, treating with some people. In the left one, we see him on his horse. In the middle one, and then we see him over here treating with the people of Claremont-created. I can say that word. I can say that names. I think a lot of this prominence in a lot of these panels comes from the horse. The horse was a thing that didn't exist in America until the Spanish brought it over. So it's really used in a lot of these to show that the Spaniards are on a higher level, that they are more powerful, more robust than many of their native enemies. It gives them an air of strength and power. Makes them into really terrible warriors. And another version of this conquest story that bears repeating that we see throughout these panels, and one that I kind of referenced earlier, is its portrayal of Malintzin. I purposely used the name Malintzin here rather than the Christian name she took, Marina, or the pejorative name that some of you might be familiar with, La Malinche. She was a native woman captured into slavery in her youth who was given by the Maya to the Spanish and who became one of Cortés' translators alongside Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spanish friar who was shipwrecked in the Yucatan Peninsula in 1511. Essentially, Cortés would speak in Spanish, Aguilar would interpret into Maya Yucateco, and then Malintzin would interpret the Maya Yucateco into Nahuatl. And then they would need to do the whole thing in reverse. And that is how these conversations would take place. Because Malintzin was a native Mexica herself who works out alongside the Spanish, her name has become a curse word in Mexican culture. You will hear people call people Malinchistas. That is like, it is the Mexican equivalent of calling someone Benedict Arnold, except it's way more loaded. Because Benedict Arnold was just a white guy who did some traitor stuff. But Malinche literally laid with the enemy because she bore Cortez's children. And so there is a prurient undercurrent to calling someone Malinchista that we don't even have when we call someone Benedict Arnold here in Spanish, here in English. These are some portrayals of La Malinche, Malintzin. This is someone who's trying to portray it in the bottom left, what she maybe would have looked like in real life. There's a lot of especially pre the independence movement and especially pre the Mexican Revolution of the 1960s, or the 1910s, there was a lot of romantic art of Malinche and Cortés, which we see here in the middle. And then since then, since her name has become such a curse word, since the specter of being a Malinchista has become so powerful, there's a lot of really dehumanizing art of her. Like we see here in this bottom right by this very famous painting by Orozco, where she's utterly dehumanized and completely nude, laid bare before the viewer as the wicked woman that she is. The lienzo, though, our document we're talking about today, does not portray Malintzin as a malevolent force, and chooses not to show Jerónimo de Aguilar at all. In nearly every image of Cortés, whether in a meeting with native peoples or in battle, Malintzin is right there with him. This reframes Malintzin as an active participant in this process, rather than a recalcitrant one, or just as a tool. Just as the horses are used in all of the battle scenes, Malintzin is used in verbal warfare to assist in the goal of conquest and dominion. She's always portrayed fully clothed here, well dressed, and often right alongside Cortez to show her prominence and her importance to this story. Many other contemporary and modern pictures of Mayan seeds appease her with malice and bad intentions, which the Lienzo happens to avoid entirely. Her presence in these panels informs the reader of this comic how integral she was to the Conquest project and how her influence reverberates through to today. There are certain things here that are really striking. As you see in the one on the left, she's armed. She's got a shield and a spear. And the one over here during the Noche Triste, she's got a shield. And so she's embodied in this way far more active and far more present than in most narratives of the Conquest, which choose to either elide her entirely or to really, really downplay her presence. And another really interesting choice that I want to talk about in the last couple minutes here is most prominent in that final third of the Lienzo, where the focus is more on interlacing battles between the natives of Tlaxcala and the other native groups, and where the heroic Tlaxcaltecans are depicted in these finely detailed armor. You see on both of these, on the left side, the Tlaxcaltecan warriors. You know, we see on the left, they're in the ocelot, the ocelot suits that they would wear, the big battle flags. And over here, they're in this really fine, almost chainmail-looking armor. That's not what it was, but that's kind of how it reads on the page. Whereas the enemies in both of these battle scenes are just in loincloths, poorly clothed, poorly armored, poorly armed. Their arms are not as powerful. We see, metal weapons on this left one. We see metal swords versus the obsidian, clubs that were popular among the Nahuatl people. And these war outfits become almost like superhero costumes in this last part of the document. We see these bright colors, we see these battle flags reinforcing their heroism versus these bad natives who are fighting against them. And so, I'm out of time, but how does looking at this like a comic reframe the way that I think about the Lienzo? Firstly, given my research topics, I never really paid that much attention to that latter third. Most people don't. Like I say, we really focus on that middle, because that's how, okay. What you guys know, okay, nobody cares. It's that middle part people get excited about, right? It gave me an opportunity to think about that bottom third in ways I never had before. And it really reinforced a lot of the ideological goals of this document in and of itself. It is not just a telling of the conquest, but a telling of the Tlaxcalans gaining prominence within New Spain's government. And they really do feel akin to superhero costumes, as you see panel after panel of these incredible, bright colored outfits. And it really has made me also rethink that Lienzo and its placement in the bigger milieu of Malinche studies and the way that it portrays her as so active, armed, involved in these conflicts, both verbal and physical, and present in ways that other documents simply elide. So it's given me a lot to think about. I'm really convinced that this is a comic. I still don't. Sorry, Scott, you're not here, but you're still wrong. I still don't agree with you. I still rankle with the idea that a thing 300 years before comics were even conceived could be one. So I guess we're just at odds there. But I do think that reframing this thing through the lens of comics has made me rethink some of my own personal assumptions about the Lienzo, and maybe want to do some more research not only on it, but some of these other documents that might possibly benefit from this sort of reading as well. Most specifically, as I mentioned earlier, that Florentine Codex, that last book of which has, it's three modalities of text between its Spanish text, its Nahuatl text, and then its images. And I'd really like to continue exploring how can looking at these things through a comic lens, even if I don't think they're comics, because I don't, makes me revisit and reimagine or rethink some of my own assumptions on them. And that is all the time I have for today.
Between the codex and that far side crap world, throw down the stuff in the water.
Look, I'm ready. Anytime you want.
Oh, what's happening? There we go. I like how you have to do this one. Yeah, I couldn't fix it. All right. My name is Mike Bittner. I'm the Associate Director of Health, Safety, and Emergency Management at Stanford University. So usually when there's a fire drill, it's because I grew it. So this was a very new experience for me. But today I am here to talk about Native American representation in Chris Claremont's X-Men comics. Okay. There we go. Okay. During his initial tenure on the X-Men titles from 1975 to 1991, Claremont presents Native characters and themes in an atypical, culturally aware manner that exhibits a more sensitive understanding of Native representation than is typically seen in superhero comics. Claremont himself is not Native American, but he used Native American characters and Native American themes to great effect. He developed the characters beyond what was stereotypically seen at the time, and he used the Native American themes in a different way to put his other characters in different situations than they would normally have been, as opposed to just the traditional trappings that you'll usually see. These are some of the sources that I primarily use for this. I have a more in-depth list of sources if you want them later, hit me up after this. But Michael Shiashi wrote Native Americans in comic books. It's a critical study. He goes character by character through Indigenous characters step by step. I highly, highly recommend it if you like this stuff. And David Troyer came up with the native savage and bloodthirsty savage phrases that I'll be using later. I just want to throw that on him so it doesn't sound like I came up with those phrases myself. But if we're going to talk about Claremont's representation of Native American characters and why it was successful or why it was effective, first we have to look at what some less effective or desperately insulting representations of Native characters were. So we are going to look at some Native representations from American history, so you know this is going to be really uplifting. First up, because superhero stories come from pulp stories, dime novels that evolved into superhero comics. We start with the dime novels. This is the least offensive one I could find. This is, Native Americans are always portrayed as the adversarial other. They are the bloodthirsty savage, as Troy referred to them. They are the opponent for the white settlers who are just minding their own business and moving west, ran into these characters. They're not given any kind of backstory, they're not given any kind of personality, they are portrayed, they're completely one-dimensional. Their appearance is always basically the same, a lot of very stereotypical Native American clothing. This eventually evolved as we evolved in superhero stories up into the 70s. This evolved into another trope, which is referred to as the noble savage by Troyer. This is where you get your sidekicks, your mentors, your magical advisors, things like that. You get characters who are native and they're not represented as bloodthirsty or anything like that, but they are monoliths. They're unchanging, they're completely informed by their culture. They are only representatives of being native. They don't have any characteristics themselves. They just exist to support the main character. Usually you see, the most famous example of this is Tonto from The Lone Ranger. You see this a lot where the sidekick, the native character sidekick, is a lot more competent than the main character. Call it the Hermione Granger effect. But the main character is being taught by the native character. And the whole time you're like, why doesn't Tonto just go solve all these problems himself? He's much better at this. Why doesn't he just go deal with it? The other thing you see a lot of is what Shiashi refers to as the best Indian is the white Indian. It is when a white character is taught or raised by Native Americans and becomes like this paragon of virtue because he was raised by Native Americans. The actual Native Americans aren't as good as him, but they train him. So he's got that in touch with nature, back to basics, warrior ethos that is kind of incorporated in a lot of these stereotypes. The magical advisors, speaking of being in tune with nature, They usually have some sort of higher power that they refer to, a great spirit, something like that, some sort of animal totem that is associated with them. You see animal motifs a lot with these characters. Speaking of themes, you're going to see a lot with these characters. So, it really hits when you put them all right next to each other like this, doesn't it? So, when you start looking at their physical appearance, which is important in a comic book, and their powers, because we're talking about superhero comic books here, you start to see a lot of themes start to come up. First example is Apache Chief from the Super Friends, neither an Apache nor a chief. Does anybody remember his magic word that he said? Good night, Chuck? Thank you. I feel very old, but it wasn't much of it. That is a made-up nonsense word, just a heads up. Also, Apache Chief was magical, and he had shamanic powers that he broke out every couple episodes. He was also an expert tracker. Next up, you've got Spirit from G.I. Joe and his Eagle Freedom. Spirit is the reason why when I joined the Army, I thought I could bring a pet. They were very clear about that. Spirit, who you'll know is a soldier, professional G.I. Joe soldier, still headband, buckskin, he's got the skirt. On top of that, he is also, every once in a while, breaks out some shamanic magical abilities. He's also an expert tracker. The haircut you'll see goes throughout. Next up, we have the very originally named Shaman from Alpha Flight. I feel like I'm the only person who's going to reference Alpha Flight in the next 5 days, but here we are. Shaman, John Byrne really just ripped off a lot of these tropes. You've got the hair, you've got the headband, you've got the skirt. He's strictly a magical character. He is also an expert tracker. I will say, in Shaman's defense, his civilian job, he is a medical doctor. So Byrne at least gave him some backstory, gave him some characterization, and he is, out of the first three, the most fleshed out character. And finally, we have my favorite example of this, which is Dawnstar from the Legion of Superheroes. Dawnstar travels through the vacuum of space in that outfit. I was a dumb kid, and even as a kid, I was like, that doesn't make... why doesn't she have a shirt? Here we are. Dawnstar's power, and remember, these first three were all expert trackers, because all native people are expert trackers. Dawnstar's power is so great that she can track anything through the vacuum of space. That's her entire power. Again, the vacuum of space that she travels in that outfit. So,
it has wings.
And it has wings, and the ring lets her fly. The wings are entirely superfluous. It is just strictly another, we gotta get an animal motif in there. We gotta remind people that she's native. One more thing that, but that was the state of things, and we'll talk about it, but it's still kind of the state of things a little bit. But Claremont came along and took over Uncanny X-Men in 1975. It was actually the issue after this, after Giant Size X-Men. What he did was, and he did this with all of his characters, but he helped create this international team, and he used where they were from to inform the characters. Instead of just being stereotypical representations, he just had that be a part of the characters. So when we get to Thunderbird, who was created pre-Claremont, but was informed by Claremont, he had a voice in the creation of the all-new, all-different cast. Thunderbird is closer to those stereotypical representations of native characters that we saw. He's got the animal motif in his costume. He's got the fringe, he's got the headband. I don't want to knock a Dave Cockrum costume that much, though, because that's still pretty cool. But Thunderbird was very rapidly written off the book because there was already a short, strong, angry guy on the team named Wolverine. He never really went anywhere, but they decided that Thunderbird didn't need to be on the team anymore. That's where Claremont came in. He had the most impact on his character for a couple of reasons. One, because he killed him in his very next appearance. But Claremont took what was a very stereotypical representation. In Thunderbird's first appearance, he's shown wrestling the buffalo to the ground just to demonstrate his strength, but again, just reinforces this is a native character, here's another animal motif, this is what the character is all about. Thunderbird really encapsulates the bloodthirsty savage trope. His powers are generically physical, he's strong, he's fast, that's it. It really ties into the warrior stereotype that is associated with Native Americans. Claremont took the character and blew him up. But what he did was, in a later issue of X-Men Classic, where Claremont was adding new back matter, he introduced the idea that Thunderbird's death wasn't accidental. It was a tacit suicide. He chose to jump on that jet because he was trying to prove himself, because he didn't feel worthy. He had a backstory that explained all of this. He had a personality, he had characteristics outside of being strictly native. That is what differentiates this character from those stereotypical portrayals. Claremont would later come back to that because again, it's a David Cockney costume, we just keep using it. But he would introduce John Proudstar's brother, James Proudstar, who would eventually become Warpath, in Uncanny 150. Sorry, it was in 1984, in New Mutant 16. He introduced this character who had the same powers as his brother, who had the same appearance as his brother, but instead of using native tropes to identify who he was, he used the death of his brother to form the character, which still kind of feels like a little bit like a Native American trope because he's using generational trauma to justify all of his actions, but at least this was more personal. This was more directed directly at the character. His goals were because of something that had happened to him, not because of something that had happened to his ancestors. And he rapidly evolved Warpath into something beyond what Thunderbird had been. He set him on the path of redemption, where he eventually became a hero. He ended up on X-Force, became a real character in his own right. Which brings us to another one of the characters that Claremont created. So Thunderbird was an amalgam of several people coming up with a character. Warpath was entirely Claremont, but it was based on Thunderbird, so there were still other people's fingerprints on there. Forge is the beginning of what was an entirely Claremont creation. And in true Claremont fashion, he really complicated them up immediately, and it's great. It really defies a lot of the tropes that we saw. First, I'm going to look at the things that Forge does that do, on the surface, look like they represent those stereotypical tropes. This is Forge's typical appearance. This is what he generally looks like. He's got the headband, usually. He's wearing buckskin boots with the fringe. You see that a lot. So he has some of those trappings, and we'll get into this more with Moonstar, but Claremont doesn't use those to identify the character. He just uses those to establish that the character cares about his heritage. They don't define him, they just inform him, which is a big difference. Forge's power set, usually with Native Americans, their power set is somehow either some sort of animal themed, especially if it's a physical power where they're faster, they're stronger, they can see further, they hear better, things like that. You see a lot of enhanced senses, a lot of super strength, a lot of super speed, a lot of super dexterity. Forge's power is that he can build anything he thinks of. It is completely outside of what is generally considered those stereotypical power sets for Native Americans. He doesn't have an energy bow and arrow. You see a lot of energy bow and arrows with these characters. He doesn't see further, he doesn't run faster, nothing like that. He just builds stuff, and that's his role within the X-Men. It's what brings him into the story that he initially appears in. He's a Vietnam vet. That informs a great deal of his personality. It informs a great deal of how he's used within the story. He also has shamanic abilities because, of course, he does. You're just like, that doesn't make any sense, but it leads to the fall of the mutants, which is pretty great. But he does. His whole character is trying to reject those magical powers and embrace his technopathy, the building machines. That's what he likes to do. His whole personality is geared towards trying to do that kind of thing. He also dates Storm. He's got a very rich backstory. There's a lot going on with Forge. Forge's whole character, as opposed to being defined by his native status, is defined by guilt. Forge feels guilty because he couldn't save his platoon during Vietnam. He feels guilty because he builds a device that eventually depowers Storm. He is driven by guilt and regret, as opposed to a lot of native characters who are driven by generational trauma or something similar to that, resentment, anything like that. Forge is just driven by guilt. He eventually comes to terms with his guilt of depowering Storm in Life Path, which is a fantastic series. But it also establishes a romance between him and Storm, which is another thing that you don't see a lot of. Instead of becoming Storm's spiritual advisor, Storm is arguably the main character of Uncanny X-Men during this time period. She gets the most captions, she gets the most dialogue, she gets the most cover appearances, and she gets the most character-centric story arcs within the book. Even when she's depowered, she's still a central part of the book. Forge ends up in a relationship with her where they are partners, they're co-equals, as opposed to him just being her spiritual advisor, him being her guide, anything like that. Thank you. So he, even in his personality, defies these native tropes. As far as, go back quick, Forge's initial appearance here, this is how he appears eventually. He's also part cyborg, hence the legs, the arms. There's a lot going on here with Forge. But this is just how he's portrayed later. This is how Forge looks when he first appears. That's just sexified. There's nothing native about how this guy looks. There's a lot of FBI here. There isn't anything that screams like Native American. This guy, and I think that was to fantastic effect. I also just really wanted to use this panel. So that's Forge. What I argue is the most effective use of Native American themes in Claremont's writing, though, and one of my personal favorite characters, which is probably why I argue that, is Danny Moonstar. I'll refer to her as Moonstar. She went by Mirage, Psych. She's had a lot of code names, but Moonstar is a cool name all by itself, so that's what I'm calling her. She was created in New Mutants graphic novel #1 by Claremont and Bob McLeod. She was the result of Claremont trying to redo what he had done in Uncanny. He was trying to recreate another international team. He created a pretty widely varied roster there. But one of them, Danny, is a Native American character. Some of her characteristics do fall into those stock Native tropes. I think a lot of it can be written up as this is adventure fiction at its core. You can use some of these tropes to give the character extra stuff they can do. It's cool if your character can track, because then you can use that to help and chase somebody through a forest or whatever. Moonstar's stereotypical trappings were more, she can communicate telepathically with animals. That's not a byproduct of her power, it's just something she can do that's never explained. She is an expert warrior. She uses stereotypically native weapons. Generally, she's armed with a dagger. Later, post-Claremont, she is eventually given an energy bow and arrow. Every time I see her, just... it was the 90s, there was a lot about that costume she was wearing, and you'd be like, no. But, speaking of appearance, Moonstar's first appearance, as designed by McLeod, but informed by Claremont, I interviewed McLeod about this, he confirmed it. Moonstar uses the Native American trappings to differentiate herself from the other New Mutants. It's not she only wears this stuff because she's Native. She's wearing this stuff because she's proud of her Native heritage, so she incorporates it into her New Mutants costume. As opposed to, that's how she dresses because she is Native. Apache Chief just looks like that all the time. She's choosing to do this to differentiate herself from everybody else. Also, her power set, which is to draw the nightmares out of people's minds and project images of them around them to freak them out, has nothing to do with her Native heritage. It's not one of the stereotypical Native powers. It is a completely different thing. Moonstar's personality is she's the leader of the team. She is, as opposed to being the mentor or the spiritual advisor or anything like that, that is actually Cannonball's role in the team. Moonstar's role is the leader. She is the one who, when they're having a day at the beach, she attacks them to remind them that they're always in danger. She's a terrible boss, but she's a cool character. But she doesn't take the role of the advisor. She also is the key character in what I would argue is the best New Mutants storyline, the Demon Bear saga. She's the main character, she's the inciting incident, she is the goal of this storyline, and it is entirely filled with Native trappings throughout. There's some problematic elements to the Demon Bear saga, but Danny being the focus of that storyline makes it incredibly effective at portraying a Native character. She would eventually gain Valkyrie powers. If you're a New Mutant, you gain Valkyrie powers, it happens. But even when she gains the powers of a Valkyrie in Asgard, she maintains enough Native representation in her appearance to still differentiate her from the typical Valkyrie. This is important to note because usually when a character gains Asgardian powers, it impacts their appearance, their method of speech, all of that. This is the case with Jane Foster Thor, who starts saying things like, "Thine, I just wanted to put in a panel that says calm down tits." But Danny doesn't do that. She maintains her personality throughout. So this is the end of my presentation, but Claremont's use of Native characters, Native depictions, Native themes throughout his 17-year run on Uncanny X-Men is an effective use of Native characters, and he created some really good ones. So thank you.
So I'm Elke Defever. I am a grad student at Indiana University, and this talk will combine kind of my main research topic for my dissertation, which focuses on representation studies, specifically women in comics, with my favorite French comics artist, Mobius, or Jean-Paul, is that name. I vaguely knew him as a child, but never read any of his works because the main thing he wrote was a series called Lieutenant Blueberry, which is a realistic Western style comic. That's not what I went for as a kid, so I knew about him, never read him. I learned more about him actually for my first talk ever, where I talked about one of his engaged comics called Push Not Law, where he calls out French racism against North African immigrants in France. And then doing the research for that, I learned that he wrote two more engaged comics, one called Wounded Knee, and one called, in French, The School of Chef Seattle, in English called The Words of Chief Seattle. Wounded Knee came out in 1979, and basically is about the 1890 massacre of Native Americans. And as you can see, they are mainly normal people. There's not too much stereotyping going on. I'm not looking at Chef Seattle, I'm not looking at Wounded Knee. In 87, he brought out The Words of Chief Seattle, which is a Native American look at the white man's use of land, it does kind of fall into that noble savage trap that Mike talked about, kind of combines it with Orientalism, which is a kind of fetishization of the exotic, basically for white people, anything that's non-white. So they do have some aspects of that stereotyping and that problem. He had an unusual approach to North American and Native American culture and ways of life. He was much less stereotypical than most of his colleagues in France at the time. And his fascination and respect for Native American culture, to me, can be seen in how he represents them in his works, which, to me, coming from a European comics tradition, sadly, was very different than what I was used to. And these two works were first published in English, as you can see they are both in English here. They were first published by Heavy Metal in Heavy Metal Presents Movies in 1981, and he himself worked on the translations, so there isn't as much of an issue of not necessarily adaptation, but translating and adaptation through translation. So I mentioned fascination with Native American culture is not unusual in Europe. His approach was different than many of his colleagues. And it's his different perspective that made me wonder about basically representations of other in Francophone comics called bande dessinée. So if you hear me say bande dessinée or BD, I mean Francophone graphic novels or comics. And then because I moved here, most of what I saw was through translation. You can't walk into a comic store in the US and find French comics, unfortunately. I tried. So my thought was, well, a representation of people by French people that then was translated for the place they originally are from, they would adapt things to be a little more respectful, right? So we'll take a quick look first at the works some of the works I'm going to be talking about. So highly popular in Europe and quite well known. I'm assuming most people know a little bit about Tintin or Tintin. He was created by Hergé in 1929, and the last album was published in 1986 posthumously. The series follows Tintin, a little reporter, ageless reporter. He's probably around like 13, 14 if you dig through things. So the whole series is kind of odd if you think about his age. But in Tintin in America, he comes to the US, specifically Chicago, to fight the, I don't remember exactly what it's called, I'm trying to find it in my notes, organized crime syndicates, which, so one of the ones he fights is called Bobby Smiles. He also fights Al Capone because he can't go to Chicago without him. So the Bobby Smiles escapes to the west because, of course, Tintin is right on his heels and will capture him because he's a little hero. And he leads Tintin to Redskin City. So first problem here. Slight problem. We'll go in more detail on the problems in a minute. But obviously the representations are quite stereotypical and are racist. Though if you're familiar with the first Tintin album, Tintin in the Congo, it's not as bad as what he did to the African people. The next one is going to be Lucky Luke by Morris, created in 1946, and is still being published. It's obviously not Morris anymore. That one is primarily focused on Lucky Luke and his exploits. It's a comical Western comic. And it does reflect popular perceptions and tropes of the American frontier, including and simplified and often problematic representations of Native Americans. So it focuses on Lucky Luke, the cowboy, and his exploits, but the series features occasional encounters with Native Americans, and often they are depicted in, almost always, in a stereotypical or caricatured manner for comedic effect or to push the plot line along, and they become the obstacle on Lucky Luke's path. Next up is Yakari, created by Job and Nuri in 1969, still being published again by somebody else. And the series follows the young Sioux boy Yakari, there on his horse, his faithful companion Little Thunder. And they explore the natural world and learn valuable lessons about courage, respect, cooperation, respect for nature, etc. So you can already get where this is going. Yes, he's got a ton of animal totems, one being an eagle, one being a rabbit, which the rabbit is called Nana Bozo. I never understood the name, but Bozo does not translate to French. So that was the French name that was just translated. I don't know why. So though Job and Nuri kind of tried to celebrate Native American culture and Native American life, they still fell into that trap of Orientalism. It's like, wow, look how in tune they are with nature, etc. So again, problematic. So the last one I want to look at is by Mobius. It's Lieutenant Blueberry. It was created by Jean-Michel Charlier, who is on the right, and Mobius, who is on the left. Charlier died in 1989, and then Mobius took over the whole series until 2003. So the album cover you see there, Geronimo Lapache, is one of the albums that is most throughout the series. He kind of calls out things about Native American culture or how people treated them, etc. This one is the most obvious defense of Native Americans. He calls out the Carlisle School, which was an attempt at forcibly integrating Native Americans into white culture, and he actually calls them out on it. So the main character in the series is Lieutenant Blueberry. He is originally racist son of a plantation owner, but in typical stereotypical fashion. He's being framed for murder, and a slave, Long Sam, he's a runaway slave, defends him and rescues him somehow. In that rescue, unfortunately, Long Sam dies, but that's kind of a turning point for Blueberry to be like, oh wait, they're not all that bad. Maybe I should defend them. So he decides to join the Union Army against the Confederates in the Civil War, and then defends the rights of Native Americans. And in the series, themes of frontier life, conflict, and survival are explored, and the narrative does delve into complexities of race, identity, and cultural exchange. It's no matter who's being shown in the series, they have depth, they have character, they are mostly developed characters. Yes. So all of these series obviously have been translated in multiple languages, English being one of them. And in that translation, the translators themselves play a crucial role in mediating between the original text and its adaptation, as much as adaptation can be done. They have to navigate complexities of cross-cultural communication and representation. And besides the obvious choosing which works to translate, many factors play a role in ensuring an accurate, respectful, and engaging portrayal of Native American characters and culture. And obviously, the works that I'm using are far from complete. representation of what's out there, but I think it's a fairly good sample of what is out there. There's a range of what people have tried to do. And the translations of these bandes dessinées contribute to construction and dissemination of specific cultural narratives surrounding natives in several ways, by either reinforcing stereotypes like Tintin or Lucky Luke, or to challenge them, sometimes in Yakari, but Yakari kind of falls in between somewhere. They try, but they fail. And Blueberry is one of the ones that tries and fights the stereotype more often. So translating these bandes dessinées for an English-speaking audience, especially an American audience, involves a very complex process influenced by linguistic, cultural, and socio-political factors. So to begin, we'll look at the complexities of translating from French to English and the challenge that translators have of conveying the linguistic content, but also cultural nuances, idiomatic expression, things like that, and historical references embedded within the original works. That is crucial in ensuring that the translated comics resonate authentically with English-speaking audiences, but at the same time maintain fidelity to the original intentions of the creator. Otherwise, you have an adaptation, not a translation, obviously. So, besides all that, bandes dessinées often reflects the historical relationships between European settlers and indigenous people, whether they do it accurately or whether they do it stereotypically or in a racist way, they do reflect that relationship. And this historical backdrop does influence how these characters are portrayed, with some comics perpetuating colonial narratives that depict indigenous people through a Eurocentric, actually Orientalist lens. For example, in Tintin in America, Elke addresses issues of land ownership and exploitation. Those are the covers of some of the English translations. So Tintin in America, a English version of a Lucky Luke, a Blueberry. So in French, Blueberry is just Blueberry. In English, he becomes Lieutenant Blueberry. And in the Yakari, as you can see, we try, but there's always the animal trope that Mike talked about. There's always animals, and he talks to animals. So anyway, in Tintin, there's a short episode where he discovers an oil,
Gusher.
I'm sorry?
Gusher,
thank you. That. And at first, all the European settlers come to Tintin and offer him increasing amounts of money, until Tintin says, oh no, this land belongs to the Blackfeet, meaning this land belongs to the Native Americans, which the settlers or the oil companies turn around, offer the Native man $25 and a half hour to get out. And within less than 24 hours, they have a city built on that ground. However, this whole episode seems to kind of judge how things are done and kind of point out that, hey, something might not be right. It just takes one page and then we move on and that's it. We never talk about it anymore. So it's kind of easily forgotten. Then there's also, besides the historical, translators also have to think of market consideration and publishing dynamics, which mostly is where the biggest problem comes in. Publishers may alter translation strategies and distribution based on perceived market demands, which can affect how Native American themes are portrayed or which ones are portrayed, and how they are perceived by the English-speaking audience, and the discrepancy in number and sequences of translated albums, which we can see in Blueberry and Lucky Luke. Blueberry, for example, has 28 albums in French, but there are only 17 albums in English, but 23 albums were translated. I know I'm terrible at math, does not add up. That is because the first 4 were translated by the original publisher, Dago. Then later albums were translated by other companies, one of them being Marvel. And the later companies often combined multiple French albums into one English album because the conventions on English or American comics weren't as strict on how long. In France, a comic was 46 pages and you're done. So coming here, they were like, wait, but we can put these 2 stories into one and save some money. And then there's also issues with Dago had many problems with their writers and who they worked with. And there was a revolt, and some of the writers took one of them being Jean-Giraud Moebius, took their business elsewhere. Moebius created his own publishing house. So in that translation, many companies don't want to deal with, we need to go and get royalties to them, and then it's a whole mess of who they need to go to, and they don't want to deal with it. Lucky Luke had a similar issue, well, similar but different. So if you ask an American reader what the first album of Lucky Luke is, he will tell you it's Billy the Kid, but a French reader will tell you Billy the Kid is episode 20. An American reader will tell you Dick Digger's Gold Mine is 48, whereas a French reader will tell you it's 1. That is because at, I think, episode or album 30, a different company took over, and that company refused to accept that there were 30 albums published by somebody else, so they started publishing at 1, even though they were already at 30-something. So that caused a lot of confusion, even in Europe. There's like 2 different number 1s, there's a bunch of number 3s, it's a mess. So translating that, nobody kind of knew what was what, and publishers here just decided, you know what, we'll take this one, and that'll be 1. The problem with that is, this is what Lucky Luke on the Billy the Kid cover, this is what he looks like in all the episodes. Except for the first one that was created, but Morris changed his look. So I've always wondered, for an American reader, you read up to 48, and then in album 48, he suddenly changes the way he looks, and in 49 he goes back to looking normal. It's kind of weird. But anyway, beyond these factors, there is a sensitivity required in portraying Native Americans. They have often perpetuated the stereotypes, the noble savage, or they are antagonistic figures, they always fight or whatever. Yakari kind of stands out for its attempt at being correct. On the right, you see an image out of that Tantan page where there is no rhyme or reason to who wears the big headdress. They all have feathers, they all have headbands. Kids will wear headdresses. Anybody, they'll wear them while they're fighting, anything. In Yakari, however, it does become clear that those are only for ceremonies or whatever. And when Yakari himself steals it from the chief, because he thinks he's got life figured out and he's this big boy now, it kind of shows him tumbling and realizing that, oh wait, this is not my thing, this is not my time, this is not my place. So it kind of tries at least at showing what and when. And I am running out of time. I could talk much longer and talk about diversity in bande dessinée, like heroic figures in Blueberry to the stereotypical spiritual guys in Yakari, or how audience perception also plays a crucial role. Depending on what is bought, obviously where money is where they're going to send their translators to. But I do hope that in this little bit I have somewhat shown that representations of Native Americans in French bande dessinée are a testament to the power of comics in shaping cultural narratives, and how the works try to bridge linguistics and cultural divides, offering insights in both historical legacies, contemporary perspectives, and by critically examining the representation as a reader, we can contribute to a more inclusive and equitable cultural landscape where diverse voices and experiences are valued and respected. That is all I have, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've got some time for questions. Raise your hands. Evan.
When I was a child, Indians they were always present. Now I'm a great so I have seen what I feel is positive growth. TV shows like What If, Predator, and stuff like that. Do you feel that we're moving in that direction, that we're having a positive movement, or is it still stagnant? I'll start with you.
To a degree, yes, there is a positive movement. I think it's mainly because us as readers, we realize that we need that. So those that have those negative representations or those stereotypical representations don't necessarily sell as much anymore. So we kind of force companies into hiring the writers that do represent the more equitable and whatnot. So I think, yes, we are moving in a correct direction. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. Nowhere near.
I completely agree with that. I did want to, you brought up Predator. Prey was a very good representation. Predator, the expert tracker, Billy, was a Native American. He could track the alien, the invisible alien through the trees. He's like, that's no man. Anyway, that wildly irrelevant. But yes, I think like you said, it's getting a little bit better every day. I do think we're getting better at calling out the negative representations. I do think there's backlash against where these characters appear, who is using them, things like that. But I do think it's getting better. We're getting better as a society of calling out companies that are using those negative tropes that you talked about.
I don't have anything to add, but I think they're both right. I think they're both right.
Dr. Jones, the document that you were presenting on, the original is from around 1500, and we have these later copies. Can you talk about just a little bit about what the art or the journaling process was like for that tribe before the Spanish conquest?
Yeah.
Because those things look to me very, very similar to medieval illuminated manuscript style.
Yeah.
So how are the Spanish, the Jesuits, how are they informing how natives are reporting on their own history from that point on?
That is exactly the trick. Almost all of the people who created these colonial era pictorial documents, specifically the Tlaxcalan linen and the Florentine Codex, were students at Jesuit schools.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of influence of European art. And in both documents, you see a lot of a fusion between pre-Columbian traditions and more and medieval European art. One of the things that's most interesting is when you see those fusions and they really start to stick out in your brain. There's a specific thing that happens in the Florentine Codex a lot. That is a specific pre-Columbian thing that starts showing up in the Florentine Codex, which again was the 1570s about is when the Florentine Codex was created. But when someone is speaking in a pre-Columbian codex, usually there are curlicues that come out of their mouth to show this person is speaking right now. And so when you look at Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, there's a particular image I always think of Cortes and Malintzin sitting on top of a roof talking down to a native person on the ground below. And Malintzin is in the process of translation because she's got little curlicues coming out of her mouth. So that kind of shows how they really are a fusion of a lot of what you'd expect from 15th century European influenced art, but still seeing some of those pre-Columbian vestiges in their art, even though they were all educated in Jesuit schools. And both of these projects were either, the Alianza de Tlaxcala was a governmental project done by a Catholic government. The Florentine Codex was overseen by a Jesuit priest who was doing this basically. He was one of the world's first ethnographers, basically. So there's a lot of that European influence, but those pre-Columbian, like, pistas still kind of stick their way through as you're looking at the document. You're like, ooh, that is before the Spanish.
Thank you.
Other questions? Time for maybe one more? All right, well, thanks very much to our panel.
So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If they won't tell it, we will.
If this the land of the free, it was a freedom then. When they annexed Hawaii and called it Cedar Lands, without any type of payment and no signing off, called themselves a republic in 1894. 1.2 million acres overtaken from the native Hawaiians. When they resisted, the West retaliated in violence and erasure. The Hawaiian language is banned as part of colonialism's plan to expand, yeah.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Multiple bombings of Kaho'olawe. As a part of their ongoing war with Asia, used it as a place for target practice. No consent or compensation. Colonizers call for annexation. No regard for all the locals. School will never let you know. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will. We will.
So if you put Hawaii into perspective, well, Black and Asian history is interconnected. Considering the fight with the Pacific, then of course, versus Asia, they was treated as a middleman for war, but didn't let the Western colorism run its course, cause dark skin was a sign of dignity to core. The land was taken in the name of capitalism, when prior to it was an actual kingdom. Clap back at the system.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. Multiple bombings of Kaho'olawe. As a part of their ongoing war with Asia, used it as a place for target practice. No consent or compensation. Colonizers call for annexation. No regard for all the locals. School will never let you know. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will. So many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will. Too many stories left to tell, even if we have to ourselves. Can keep history on the shelf. If we won't tell it, we will.